Hinduism is a religion followed by 1 billion people and extends back 3,000 years. We're going to be asking some deep questions today. Welcome to another edition of the Bordering on Belief podcast. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Ankur Barua, who is a senior lecturer in Hindu studies at the University of Cambridge. He completed his undergraduate degree at St Stephen's College, University of Delhi in physics, and then did his PhD in the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge. Dr Barua, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Muhammad, for inviting me to speak to you.
Let's get straight into it. How would you define Hinduism, and what is the glue that makes it a single coherent tradition?
The simplest answer to your question is that we should not think in terms of Hindu-ism, which implies that there is one fixed set of beliefs and practices that is applicable to all people who regard themselves as Hindu. Instead, we should think of Hinduisms in the plural. Here is a more complex answer. When we study the development of Hindu beliefs and practices over the last 3,000 years in South Asia, we find a dynamic combination of some long-range similarities alongside numerous regional dissimilarities. By this, I mean to say that Hindus from, say, North India and Hindus from South India would generally recognize one another as Hindu, even if they may disagree significantly on various matters of belief and practice. So let us use the double negation. Hinduism is neither one nor many. Here, neither one is a reminder that as we study the Hindu traditions, we need several poly prefixes. So Hinduisms are polycentric traditions. If we go looking for one particular center and declare once and for all, I have isolated the heart of Hinduism, and here is that center, the one invariant core, you may soon encounter 3 or 4 or 10 more such centers. Likewise, Hinduisms are polymorphic formations. They comprise multiple forms that have been developing over 3,000 years in South Asia. Again, Hinduisms are polylinguistic textures. The sacred language, as we know, is Sanskrit, but there are multiple vernacular expressions of these sacred Sanskrit archetypes. However, why do I add nor many? This is because if you were to attend my undergraduate lectures at Cambridge across 3 years, you would see that although Hinduism is not simply one thing, it is also the case that Hinduism is not anything and everything under the sun.
So that's what we're getting to now. So what is that thing that unites these Hinduisms?
So there are some overlapping patterns, some overlapping similarities across these polycentric, polymorphic, and polylinguistic dissimilarities. And to highlight this point, let's say here is a conceptual distinction between two senses of the word Hinduism. In one sense, Hinduism is a cultural phenomenon. So we will sometimes encounter Hindus who may speak in this way regarding specifically religious views about the world, say regarding our true source and ultimate destiny. I'm a non-believer or an agnostic, but I have certain cultural sensibilities that I have inherited from sources that are regarded in my wider group as Hindu. And that would be an example of someone who understands themselves as culturally Hindu, but not religiously Hindu. For instance, such a Hindu may wish to be cremated and not buried, not because cremation is associated with specific cosmological beliefs that they affirm, but because cremation is the common cultural practice. And there are, of course, some individuals who regard themselves not only culturally as Hindu, but also religiously as Hindu. So regarding your question about what is the common thread, think of Hinduisms in terms of a palimpsest, that is a parchment on which you can write something and erase it and write on it again. So when you look at this parchment or this palimpsest called Hinduisms, with what I sometimes call a temporal telescope, a telescope that helps you to see through time, you will find that multiple layers have been sedimented on top of one another. Some of these layers have become partly erased, some of them have become completely erased, some of them are still visible, and some of them are being reworked and retooled. And this dynamic oscillation between past and present is this palimpsest. So there are some crisscrossing threads through these tapestries. And I cannot tell you, here is this one unique cement or connecting glue that runs through all these tapestries, all these cultural patterns that have been developing over 3,000 years. But hopefully in our discussion today, I will be able to highlight some of these overlapping similarities, as I've called them.
At least we could say that geographically there is a unifying factor. I mean, Hinduism is within the Indian subcontinent. Is that correct to say?
Yes. So let's say if one had to kind of pinpoint one particular answer, one could say a type of engagement with the concept of the Veda. So the term Veda reflects sacred wisdom, and not all Hindus accept Vedic authority. They may retool or reconfigure Vedic authority, but the idea of Vedic wisdom has great religious and cultural prestige.
Okay, well, that takes us very nicely to the next question. If there is some deep engagement with the Veda at some level, tell us about the Vedas and the other sources of Hinduism. I think one of the things for an outsider is it's quite hard to get a grasp on what scripture means in Hinduism compared to, say, Judaism or Islam. Tell us about the sources.
So that's a very good question, and also a very difficult question, because there are so many multiple sources, and not all these sources are accepted by different Hindu traditions. So instead of asking or answering the question from a scriptural note, let me begin on an anthropological note by reformulating your question in this way. If tomorrow you and I were to go to a town in North India and ask the Hindus we meet there, which scriptural sources do you refer to in navigating the real-world complexities of your life? What would they say? And by real-world complexities, I mean things such as the following. Your daughter's marriage is taking place next week. You have to take a loan with heavy interest. Or your uncle is in hospital and you have to go to New Delhi for a job interview, and so on. Now, many Hindus, they belong to traditions which have been established by gurus. And the word for tradition is sampradaya. So what does the job description, so to speak, of a guru look like? For starters, a guru is supposed to be deeply immersed in a spectrum of sacred Sanskrit texts such as the Vedas, roughly 1500 BCE, the Upanishads, roughly 800-600 BCE, and the Bhagavad Gita, roughly 200 CE. The Vedas and the Upanishads, and sometimes the Bhagavad Gita, are characterized as Shruti, that is, divine revelation. The word Shruti means that which is heard. So the idea is that Shruti contains truth that is passively received by certain sages. The Vedas do not have human composers. And precisely for this reason, the Vedas are infallible. Next, the guru would generally also be immersed in yet another spectrum of Sanskrit texts, such as the narratives, the epic narratives, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and the Dharma Shastras, which outline the multiple meanings of dharma. Now, the word dharma is extremely polyvalent. That is, it has multiple meanings, such as cosmic order, moral behavior, social structure. And these texts are characterized as smriti, which means that which is remembered. Now, as we know, human memory is fallible, so if there's a conflict between Shruti and Smriti, it is Shruti that has scriptural or hermeneutic priority.
Just to remind, Shruti means almost like revealed or divine origin texts of the Vedas.
And you can think of Smriti as human tradition that is passed down in across generations. So these are the two main bodies of text, but even that is not enough. Finally, in traditions centered around the devotional worship of deities such as Vishnu, Krishna, Shiva, Rama, or the goddess Devi, there will be yet another spectrum of texts which too are said to be divinely revealed. So the moral of the story, if you want to put it this way, is this, that if you wish to become a Hindu guru, be prepared to read a vast range of texts. But even that is not enough. You will have to synthesize or harmonize all these texts to present what you claim is their true meaning. As we know, scripture sometimes seems to speak in multiple voices. For instance, I noted a possible conflict between Shruti and Smriti. So your homework as a guru would be to demonstrate that all these voices are ultimately speaking in a symphony. And now, finally, to answer your question, many Hindus do not have the time or the training to swim through this vast ocean of texts. So you can think of the guru as their holy island. And the guru will give you a set of teachings about the perennial questions of humanity, such as why are we here, how we got here in the first place, how we should live our lives, what is the true destination, and so on. So in other words, the guru has done their hermeneutic homework.
So I understand from that multiple textual sources, a hierarchy of textual sources, but for the common man, the necessity of someone very learned, deeply infused with these sources to interpret that, reconcile it, and present it to them as everyday teachings.
Indeed, the guru is viewed as an embodiment of spiritual gravity. The guru is the one who knows. The guru is the one who is able to give you the compass points through which you may navigate the turbulent oceans of the world. And that is a very common analogy that is used in devotional poetry. So I say, for example, if I were not the lecturer in Hindu studies, I would not have to start from scratch and read through all these texts. I would typically go to a particular guru and say, can you communicate to me this wisdom?
And are they all in Sanskrit or some not in Sanskrit?
So some of them are in Sanskrit, some of them are in the multiple vernaculars like Bengali, Assamese, Hindi, Tamil, Marathi. And just to give you one example, which will fit into my previous answer. So when I was growing up in Assam, the guru of some members in my family was somebody called Honkordem, who wrote in a 15th century form of Assamese. Now, many years later at Cambridge, I wrote my PhD dissertation partly on another guru from Tamil Nadu called Ramanuja, who wrote in Sanskrit. Now, there are many significant variations between what these two gurus or theologians have to say about the structure of reality, but at the same time, they agree that the true meaning of our human existence is to surrender oneself wholeheartedly, single-mindedly to the divine reality. And this set of ideas and experiences is called bhakti. So that would be one example of what I meant earlier by a long-range similarity in the presence of numerous regional dissimilarities in the palimpsest of Hinduisms with respect to region, with respect to language, with respect to cultural formation.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you. Right, one of the things which to an outsider seems a little challenging is that on the one hand, if you were to read the Upanishads, you get a very high, abstract, philosophical level of teaching. And if you were to read things like the Mahabharata, Ramayana, the epics, the Puranas, with mythology, stories, which may be a little bit more challenging for a modern secular person or someone coming from outside of it, it seems as if they're almost like two different types of religion. Is that the wrong way to look at it? Are they all part of a coherent whole? Should they be viewed very differently?
So that is a very good question. Let me see how to take it. Let me begin by making a point that is so obvious that we may be oblivious to it. We are now having a conversation in present-day English about ideas formulated in Sanskrit and the numerous Indian vernaculars. So in such cross-border intellectual exercises, there's always the vexed matter of translation. And people often complain that things are lost in translation, but I like to think that sometimes new things are found in and through translations. So let's say we talk about these two conceptually loaded terms, mythology and philosophy. And it may be difficult to find precise one-to-one equivalents for these two English words, themselves derived from ancient Greek, in ancient Hindu or Indic contexts. But suppose, just to make my task easier, suppose I were to say, mythology means a story fabricated by human beings, and philosophy means deep truth about the nature of reality. And generally speaking, the Hindu traditions do not use these two concepts in this antagonistic way. Rather, a mythic or a mythological narrative can be the conveyor of deep philosophical truth claims. So let me give you one example. Here is the great epic narrative Mahabharata, which is centered around a bloody, almost apocalyptic battle between two groups of fraternal cousins. And the Mahabharata is regarded as Smriti. So if you wish, you may regard the Mahabharata as a quote-unquote mythological narrative. This does not mean, according to some religious commentators, that this narrative is simply a human invention. As it so happens, a figure called Krishna plays a very crucial role in the Mahabharata. And according to some commentators, this narrative records the divine intervention of Krishna in human history. So what looks like from one vantage point simply as an intriguing story is from another vantage point a spiritual allegory of how God preserves the world from cosmic destruction. And one more example would be the other great epic narrative, the Ramayana, which can be read as a quote-unquote mythological narrative of how a prince called Rama rescues his wife Sita, who has been abducted by a demon king. Once again, according to some commentators, this will be only the, so to speak, the surface grammar of the Ramayana. The true deep grammar of the Ramayana is that God has intervened to restore cosmic order. That is dharma. And indeed, on one account, the festival of Diwali celebrates this restoration of dharma, symbolized by light, from the heart of adharma, symbolized by darkness. And in my previous answer, I think I did not mention the Puranas. So the Puranas are again a rich source of what we may call, quote-unquote, mythological narratives. Some of these Puranas are dedicated to specific deities such as Shiva or Vishnu. And again, the Puranas would also be regarded as divine revelation of how God is acting in human history. So to summarize, my point is that if the medium is the message, then mythology is the medium and philosophy is the message.
Yeah, got you. So what we call mythology, and I take your point that even labeling it like that is a kind of extramural approach to the tradition, but that is the vehicle of teaching the philosophical truths that the Vedas want to reveal. Would you agree that it's in the cultural milieu of its recipients, i.e. it is very much in an Indian worldview?
Indeed. So think of this Indian worldview as a worldview of storytelling, right? Where today when we say story, we say, oh, story means something that has been just made up. But think of a story as a narrative. A story has a narrative structure about the beginning, about the middle, and hopefully an end. Our human lives are stories that we tell about ourselves with respect to many different people who become part of our existential stories. And about 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, there were no printed books. So these great epic narratives called the Ramayana and the Mahabharata would be narrated, would be told by these people who are traveling from one place to another. And partly they are responding to contemporary crisis, and maybe they're trying to unfold that recent event into the developing narrative of the Ramayana, of the Mahabharata. This is why we have multiple editions of the Mahabharata. Some run into 70,000 verses, some run into 95,000 verses. How do you explain this? Because it is all the language game of Smriti, what is remembered by people. Some people thought it is necessary to remember that story.
One thing which I particularly really want to understand from this interview is the following question. Generally, people consider Hinduisms as polytheistic traditions, multiple gods. Yet, the deeper you go, you do hear other presentations of the divine. For example, henotheism, that there's only one supreme god, but there are other additional gods, or monism, non-duality, that everything is really just one divine consciousness. And sometimes you do hear traditions which you talk about monotheism, that there's actually only one God. Can you just help us understand how these terms apply to Hinduism?
So, if I may begin by returning to my point about translation, I mean, all these three terms that you mentioned just now are ultimately derived from Greek, and over the last 2 millennia of European intellectual history, they have acquired complexly layered Christian theological connotations. So, depending on what these terms mean or do not mean, we will find Hindu thinkers, texts, or traditions where they are applicable or not applicable. Now, let me state somewhat bluntly that to claim that religious Hinduism, and more specifically forms of philosophical Hinduism called Vedantic Hinduism, is quote-unquote polytheistic is to make a rookie error. whenever I hear people say Hinduism is polytheistic without introducing some qualifications, my heart sinks. Oh no, not that one again, I say to myself. I'm somewhat okay with people saying Hindus are idol worshippers. It all depends on what you mean by the crucial term idol and what you mean by the crucial term idolatry. But the term polytheism is not as conceptually loaded as the term idol. Let's simply say polytheism is the worship of multiple deities, treating each deity as the ultimate reality. And let me highlight the term ultimate reality. The question we are asking is not this, are there multiple deities in your ritual calendar? But this, is each one of these multiple deities the ultimate reality? Now here is a dialogue from a scripture called the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Great Forest Upanishad. This is dated at sometime around 800, 700 BCE, before the Common Era. And someone called B. Dagda Shakalya has raised this question to a particular sage. How many gods are there? And the word is Deva. And the sage replies, 3,306 gods. And if the dialogue were to end there, the point would be proved, guilty as charged, and this is the proverbial Hindu polytheist. But this figure repeats the question several times by saying, but really how many gods are there? And in this way, a series of answers is given, 33, 6, and 1.5. And finally the sage says, 1, Eka. And this is this text from 700, 600 BCE. And this theological claim that the ultimate reality, that would be called Brahman in some other texts, is one, while the multiple minor deities are multiple, receive some distinctive formulations across the vast array of Hinduisms, that palimpsest I was talking about. So to quickly run through some of these terms, Hindus known as Shaiva, Brahman is Shiva, and the multiple divinities that populate the ritual landscape are so many Shaktis, powers or manifestations of Shiva. For Hindus who are known as Vaishnava, Brahman is Vishnu or Krishna or Rama, who is the supreme object of worship when different gods and goddesses are venerated. And finally, for Hindus who are known as Shakta, Brahman is the goddess, Devi, and here too Brahman is the ultimate source of multiple divinities who carry out different cosmological operations. And you may have noted that I have helped myself to the language of worship and veneration that Roman Catholic theologians sometimes use. So the Hindu Vedantic philosophical claim too is that Brahman alone is to be worshipped, and all these other deities may be venerated insofar as they point the way to Brahman.
Okay, but are they manifestations of Brahman, or are they emanations from Brahman, or are they localizations of Brahman?
So again, depending on how you are using these three terms, manifestations, expressions, or localizations, so I take it that you are taking these three terms to be conceptually distinct. That there's something about a manifestation which is not an emanation, something about an emanation that is not a localization. So if you take these three concepts as distinct, then the answer is that there are Hindu traditions, sampradaya, which do take it as distinct. So say there is a tradition called Advaita Vedanta. Now I'm not quite sure how you're using these three terms, but let's say Advaita Vedanta may say it is some kind of a manifestation, so Brahman is ultimately beyond form, beyond name, beyond space, beyond time, beyond description, but somehow this absolutely indivisible Brahman has become manifested as you and me and as this laptop. The other forms of Hinduism, which we may cluster under the group of bhakti traditions, they may tend to use the term localization. I mean, if I have understood how you're using the term localization, that there is some measure of distinction between us and Brahman, namely Vishnu or Shiva or Rama, but the divine reality, the divine presence becomes localized, as it were, in a temple on the seashore in the sky. That again takes me back to my first answer about the palimpsest, right? I mean, if you are asking me like, what is that one connecting thread through all these different readings of Upanishads and Vedas, there you go. You already have given me three very beautiful words. One is a manifestation, one is an emanation, one is a localization. And there are Hindus who would accept one and not the other two.
You mentioned Advaita Vedanta there. It's something which I find very interesting. Could you explain a bit more what non-dualism, and then another foreign term, how that translates in Hinduism, in the idea that there is only one reality and all of us and the gods and ourselves and the laptop and everything are part of that. Just explain that first of all, and then I just want to dive a bit deeper into it.
So, as we begin to talk about Advaita, let me highlight the point that we are moving into the realm of paradox.
Right.
And I said this right at the beginning because any attempt to explain Advaita by using rational categories is doomed to fail. And this is because all these commentaries on Advaita will themselves tell you that Advaita is a spiritual vision that uses human reasoning to indicate that reasoning does not apply to deep reality.
So we're using the wrong tool almost when we're using reason and language.
Yes. But because you have asked me a question, the burden of proof is on me to answer it. So let me say that let me change the lens a little bit and say it is slightly easier to talk about Advaita in terms of experience. So let's say here is an example. On the 5th of July next year, you are walking along the peaceful shores of Lake Windermere. And suddenly, for a few fleeting moments, you feel that there is one unbroken stream of cosmic life flowing through the waters, the blue skies, the yellow birds, the daffodils, and most importantly, your innermost being. So you feel that there is one undivided stream of existence flowing through everything. And this feeling is a reflection of Advaita, in the sense that for those fleeting moments, you feel that you are completely at one with the universe, and the universe is completely at one with you. Now, the Sanskrit word Advaita, the negative prefix a, followed by the word Dvaita, means the state or condition of not two-ness. To explain that, the claim is that between all the multiple discrete objects that we see in our everyday lives, such as this laptop and that cup, or the dog inside the house and the cat on the tree, there is a state of ontological not two-ness. So I'm using the slightly heavy term ontological.
Yeah, just clarify. You're saying not two-ness there.
Not two-ness.
Not two-ness, like non-duality.
Yes. So the literal meaning of the term Advaita, so a means not and dvaita means two-ness.
Got you.
So it's a negation of the claim that there is a two-ness between me and the laptop, this dog and that cat. And then I said, this claim is ontological. It's a slightly heavy word that philosophers use. And this term is quite crucial here. So the term ontological means regarding the structure of deep reality. Mm-hmm. So on most interpretations, Advaita is not claiming that there are no empirically meaningful distinctions between my laptop in the room and the cow in the field. What Advaita is claiming is that if I were to make an ultimate inventory of the universe, I would not have to count independent objects such as laptop, dog, cat, John Smith, Milky Way, and so on in an infinitely large set. And this is because all these objects that I mentioned are in a state of not two-ness with Brahman, which is the ultimate foundation.
Again, I'm a bit hesitant now because you said that this whole discussion is beyond normal language and reason, but I'm going to press on anyway, and you can correct me if I go astray. One of the questions I think all theists have a problem to answer is, why did God do anything? Why did God create us at all? You know, it's a challenging question in all traditions. In Advaita, is there an answer to why the ultimate reality of Brahman manifested, or a differentiation or multiplicity occurred at all, such that we are here talking about these things?
So when you say that, I started off by saying that Advaita, we can talk about it better through the lens of experience. But let me actually take a few steps back and point out that in Advaita commentaries also, they do use certain types of analogies. So the idea is not that we cannot reason our way to some extent. The point is that ultimately, in the ultimate analysis, so I will quickly retrace and give you a standard analogy that is used, and that will help me to use the concept of Maya, which is a kind of answer to your question as well. So here is a standard analogy. Let's say I have 3 pots made of clay, one from China, one from Italy, one from London. And these 3 clay pots have distinct names and forms, nama, rupa, but they are all substantially clay. However, we are generally in the condition of ignorance or avidya, or sometimes it's called maya, about our fundamental rootedness in Brahman, which is why we are not able to go beyond surface appearances and see the deep golden thread of interconnection. However, Brahman remains absolutely untainted by this defect called avidya or maya. So nothing has happened to Brahman in the seeming production of the world from Brahman. Now, with a deep breath, I'm going to ask, is this account of Advaita, which Advaita claims is the true meaning of the Upanishads, is this coherent? Is this plausible? Is it meaningful? And I say with one deep breath, because the last 1200, 1000 years of Hindu Vedantic philosophical inquiry has been shaped by this, let's call this dialectical ping pong between defenders of Advaita and critics of Advaita. So critics of Advaita say that this whole account is not meaningful with respect to devotional worship, with respect to practices of, like surrendering yourself to the deity, because you need to speak of some measure of distinction.
Exactly. I'm glad you raised that, because that's a problem I've always tried to understand, is who is doing the worship if actually all is one.
Yeah, indeed. No. So when you say you struggle to understand, you are not at all alone. Welcome to the club, is how I would put it. And this is, to repeat, this is a long-standing exegetical, philosophical, conceptual debate running through all these Vedantic Hindu traditions. So again, you see why, in response to your first question, I was struggling to say what is that one glue that holds the whole thing together. So all these different philosophical schools, they're using the same language of karma, samsara, atman, brahman, moksha, but they fundamentally disagree about what type of distinction there is or there is not between deity and devotee.
Thank you. Let's move now on to another topic, which is murti, or idols. How do Hindus view that physical idol in front of them, and how is their view different to the idolatry that is condemned, say, in the Old Testament or the Quran about bowing down to a graven image? What's the difference in view there?
So this is a very good question, and I must thank you for asking me this question, because there is a lot to be said about this. So I will first begin by developing what some Hindus may think is the strongest possible defense of image worship. And then in this kind of dialectical manner, I will give the strongest possible critique of that defense. So the term idol worship is slightly pejorative, so let's use a slightly neutral term, image worship. Now, when you say that what outsiders may call idolatry, I would rephrase your statement as what outsiders, as well as some Hindus themselves, might call idolatry, right? So here is a conceptual problem that religious traditions, Hindu, Islamic, and Christian, engage with in their own distinctive ways. And the problem is this: what type of similarity between humanity and divinity can we meaningfully articulate? So that's the question. What type of similarity? So to state the obvious, the divine reality is not my uncle who is a mortal being. So the divine reality has to be different, even categorically different. But now the crux of the matter is how different. If the divine reality is so utterly different that nothing whatsoever can be said about the divine reality, we would be reduced to complete silence. So there will be no living tradition of worship. So the challenge is how to talk meaningfully about a point of contact between humanity and divinity. And from a theological point of view, this is the question that Hindu image worship is trying to address. The claim is that through an image, through a murti of God, God who is otherwise humanly unimaginable, through the murti we are able to meditatively direct our attention to God. And this term image worship is somewhat misleading, as it suggests that it is the spatio-temporal object called the murti that is to be worshipped. Rather, the true object of worship, puja, is God who is and who is not one particular murti in a household shrine or in a temple. So here we go back to my previous distinction between veneration and worship. And in these Hindu religious traditions, some type of distinction between image and deity is generally made, partly because these worldviews are rooted in the Upanishads, which tell you that the ultimate reality goes beyond all categorical descriptions. So here is a small verse from the Brihad Upanishad, which says that the imperishable, that is Akshara, is without taste, without smell, without sight, without hearing, without speech, ... goes on. So Hindu theistic traditions, they contain certain caveats to make sure that individuals do not conflate a human-made image with the non-limitable Brahman, but are somehow trained to see Brahman as veiled within the image. So you can think of matter as a veil of the spirit, which means that the non-spatio-temporal Brahman cannot be squeezed into a small object that is, say, 5 feet tall, but the claim is that Brahman can be ritually invoked or invited to make this finite object a habitation so that devotees can have a darshan of the divine.
Are you saying the murti is a window to the divine, or are you saying the murti is a kind of way of bringing the divine to a particular locus?
So I would say both. I mean, so the murti is both a window and a pathway and an avenue to the divine. And the reason why the murti is able to perform this role, because the murti is not anymore mere matter. When a particular mantra has been recited or chanted so as to consecrate that piece of matter becomes, let's say, transfigured or even transubstantiated. So what I cannot do is that I cannot just say, take this object and say, okay, let me worship this as a murti. So this particular piece of matter has to be properly consecrated with rituals, with various kinds of chanting. And then although a non-devotee may just see mere matter, glass or metal or stone, to the devotee, it's not mere matter anymore. It is both a localization of the divine presence and an avenue and a pathway to the divine reality.
I'm just wondering, I'm very cautious about oversimplifying things, but is this a bit similar to when somebody looks at a sunset or a rainbow and they feel that God's presence is directly in front of that physical thing that they are seeing? Is it similar to that or different?
Yes, I mean, I would say we are basically operating with the same logic. The claim is that to feel or to experience the presence of God in the material dimension does not negate God's presence, but only amplifies it. Because if God is omnipresent, then God has to be present in the laptop, in the sunset, in the tree. So we are using that theologically dangerous preposition in. What do I mean by God is in the laptop? Because of course God is not contained by the laptop, God is beyond the laptop, and yet I can say that if I were to compose a song of praise, a hymn of praise to God, I can feel that by composing this song of praise to God on my laptop, somehow the laptop, which is, let's say, profane matter, has become a locus of the sacred. I would just like to add one more point in defense of the strong view. So regarding what I was saying just now, that what I cannot do is I cannot just pick up a piece of matter and say, okay, here you go, this is a murti. So there are certain ritual texts about how this murti is to be consecrated, constructed, and how what is called the life breath or the prana is to be installed in that murti, so that the murti becomes indwelled by the deity. So that is, let's say, my strongest possible defense of image worship.
You did mention, and I have also discovered, that there is a counter trend which is very anti-image worship and says that this needs to be rejected and we need to return to the kind of formless conceptions of the divine. Could you tell us a little bit more about those anti-idol, more kind of monotheistic in the terms that we understand movements?
So again, that's a very important question because it is a relatively unknown fact that the Hindu religious traditions have various types of reasons for challenging or rejecting the arguments that I just highlighted. So let's go back to some Sanskrit terms that are relevant to this debate, nirguna and saguna. Now, as we know, every translation is already an interpretation, and what these two terms, nirguna and saguna, mean is yet another massively debated point across different Hindu philosophical traditions. But to keep things simple, the word guna means quality or attribute. So translating literally, nirguna would mean without attributes and saguna would mean with attributes. So with respect to the theistic traditions of image worship I discussed just now, the crucial term nirguna means that God is without any human-like imperfection. But Brahman or God is supremely personal, and God is saguna, has a distinct name like Rama or Vishnu, has a particular iconographic form like Krishna. So supremely personal means that God has all these qualities like omnipotence, omniscience, sovereignty, but God does not have any spatio-temporal limitations. Now, the standard critique to this claim is, well, how is it possible that Brahman that you claim is supremely personal, therefore Brahman is not divisible, not limitable, is also present in this image in the temple in front of me? And the ultimate answer that these traditions may give is divine mystery. And if you want a Sanskrit word, it is lila. So as we know, all religious traditions invoke the category of mystery at some point in their chain of explanation. And these traditions that talk about image worship may say it is the mystery of God's lila, that the boundless God without any bounds yet becomes freely bound to the love or bhakti of the devotees through God's presence in the image. Now, so far the positive side. Not every Hindu thinker accepts this particular exegesis of scripture. So I put it this way just to highlight to you that the debate is about how to read scripture. All these people are not saying things like, actually I don't like images. Well, I just don't like them. You cannot talk like that. If you're a theologian, you have to say that this is not the meaning of the Upanishads. This is not the meaning of the Bhagavad Gita. So according to the tradition of non-dualism or Advaita, we were discussing briefly a while ago, the ultimate teaching of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, is that Brahman is completely nirguna, and here nirguna means Brahman is completely beyond name, beyond form, beyond description. And the reason why I say ultimate teaching is because the Advaita tradition may allow, in some cases, that this type of image worship is a useful tool for people who are not able to contemplate this deep not-to-ness. But in the ultimate analysis, Brahman is complete ineffable silence, without name, without form. So that is the long-standing debate across Hindu traditions, and the jury is still out.
So could somebody say, I am a Hindu and I just want to show devotion to Brahman without ever recourse to a murti?
Yes. So say there are so many different Hindu traditions where the idea of the murti, even if it is present as part of their theological system, is not as predominant or as significant as some others. Such as what? Say, for example, in Tamil Nadu, there is the Sri Vaishnava tradition where the notion of the image, what is called the archa, is very important there. So one of God's many, I was going to say manifestations, but then I realized I've used the word manifestation in a certain way. So one of God's many localizations is called the archa. And the idea of image worship is very important in the Sri Vaishnava tradition and in the Ballava tradition in Gujarat. But there are some other traditions where even if they say God is Shaguna, they may not have any particular temples or massive temples. They may have a particular notion of God as omniscient, omnipotent, filled with mercy and compassion.
Well, that leads us on to the next question, which is that there are some modern Hindus who are presenting Hinduism as essentially a monotheistic religion, which is very similar to kind of the common monotheism between the Old Testament and the Quran, which is of a single unified higher being, God, divine, and they don't involve image worship. Do you think that that is a legitimate evolution of Hinduism, or do you think it's an accommodation because Hinduism has now come into contact with Western ideologies? Do you think it's a reinterpretation of scripture? Is it Vedic based, or is it people just trying to come across as more acceptable to, say, people of other faiths?
I would say it is a combination of all of these different possibilities that you highlighted. And I say this because, say, over the last 150 years, a galaxy of Hindu thinkers, writers, and social activists have engaged with the idea of the West by retooling pre-colonial worldviews. At the same time, we should not exaggerate the impact of the West by claiming that these pre-modern worldviews were completely restructured from ground zero upwards. Because what these Hindu thinkers did, they sometimes creatively reworked certain Sanskritic and vernacular materials and selectively appropriated or critiqued Western ideas, including claims made by Christian missionaries. For instance, sometime around 1880 or 1900, some Hindu thinkers indeed claimed that true Hinduism is free of polytheism and idolatry, but they do not do so by saying, this is what it says in the Bible. Rather, their claim is that these elements are found in Smriti texts and not Shruti texts.
Who said that?
So a figure would be like something like Dayananda Saraswati of the Arya Samaj, founded in 1885. So the claim would be that Shruti is infallible revelation and Smriti comprises human compositions. So what is stated in Smriti, idolatry, polytheism, if you want to use these terms, can be negated or abrogated by Shruti, which are the Upanishads. Now, sometime earlier, I mentioned that for some people in my family in Assam, the guru is Shankardeb. And here are two lines from a song composed by Shankardeb, or possibly his immediate disciple Madhavdev, sometime around the 16th century. And these are two very brief lines. I will sing them and then I will translate them for you. Hamai he bahu Ramo sarana duja O kahe korohu hamu awari puja, which means I devote myself to the service of the feet of God Rama. Why would I worship any other god? Now, this is as robustly monotheistic as it gets. Sometimes you may hear the claim that Hindu thinkers picked up this kind of language from Muslim theologians or Christian missionaries. But in the 16th century, in a remote part of Assam, Madhavdev is not borrowing any such language. He is retooling a 10th century Sanskrit text called the Bhagavata Purana, which itself is reworking some ideas from the 2nd century Bhagavad Gita. So that is one concrete example of how there are both borrowings. I don't mean to deny that forms of modern Hinduism have been significantly impacted by the idea of the West, yes, but the basic conceptual vocabulary was not supplied by the West.
Okay, final question. In your personal reading of the Vedas, the Upanishads, what do you think is the highest vision of the divine that is presented?
If what you mean by personal reading is a reading that I can claim as completely my own, in the sense that I have arrived at it independently of any external influence, I can only say I'm not quite sure if I have such a reading. And because, before we become scholars, we are also human beings who are raised in a certain way and have a certain type of childhood upbringing. But while that is not relevant, let me quickly say something about that, because it's also kind of relevant maybe to the kind of language that I use in answering questions. In my early life, I received a rigorous training in, or I sometimes unself-consciously picked up 3 styles of music. So Hindu bhajans, devotional songs, and Indo-Islamic songs in the genre of zikr and naat sharifs, and hymns used in Roman Catholic churches. So today when I study the content of this music across South Asian religious traditions through a scholarly lens, I sometimes feel the force of William Wordsworth's dictum, the child is the father of the man. But with these caveats, here is the answer to your question. So I'm going to directly answer your question now. In my personal reading, the highest vision of the divine reality, according to Hindu scriptural sources, is a style of mystical monotheism. And let me explain the phrase mystical monotheism. So certain forms of monotheism highlight God's transcendence, that is God's sovereignty, without sufficiently and simultaneously emphasizing God's immanence, that is God's accessibility. And what I mean by this slightly cryptic term mystical monotheism is a style of monotheism where the supremely majestic Lord, who does not need anything from us, is also the delightfully sweet beloved who somehow yearns for our love. So that is a response in English, but let me give you some Sanskritic terminology to help you understand this. The Vaishnava Hindu traditions speak of various bhavas of the devotee with respect to the Lord, and this word bhava may be translated as devotional sentiment. And one such bhava is the bhava called dasya, and this is the humble sentiment of submission of a servant towards their master. So that's one bhava. There is one more bhava called madhurya, and madhurya bhava is the ecstatic sentiment of intimacy of a lover towards their beloved. And in what I'm now calling mystical monotheism, the fundamental claim is that these two bhavas are not antagonistic, but somehow mystically, if you will, are deeply intertwined. And to give you a very concrete example of how this works, here is a very short song, only 4 lines from the famous Bengali poet-thinker Rabindranath Tagore. And as you will see, Tagore in this very short song, which really summarizes vast amounts of Hindu scriptural traditions, Tagore interweaves the notion of God as friend and the notion of God as a Lord in the same song. So 2 lines I will translate, 2 lines I will translate, and then I will conclude. He shokha momo hridaye raho, he shokha momo hridaye raho, ও সংসারে সব কাজে ধ্যানে জ্ঞানে হৃদয়ে রহো. My friend, remain with me in my heart, in all my worldly work, in all my thoughts, in all my awareness. So this is friend. And now let's see what he says. অনাথ তুমি এসো ধীরে, সুখ দুঃখ হাসি নয়ন নীরে, লহ আমার জীবন ঘিরে. My Lord, come to me gently now, in my joys and sorrows, in my laughter and streams of tears, and circle me on all sides. And in my personal reading, to use your phrase, this is the highest vision of the scriptures.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful and moving. What's interesting is that a lot of the language you were using in that last answer is very similar to Sufi Muslim writing? This could have come straight out of Ibn Arabi or Rumi or so on.
I mean, it is only because this talk is about Hinduism. I did not use the language of Jamal and Jalal, but I could have easily dropped in a reference to that.
Dr. Ankur Barua, that's been a very enlightening discussion. See you again next time.